The world had always seemed unshakable from David Shaw's towering office window. But today, that illusion was shattered in an instant. The hum of his phone, the relentless flicker of corporate messages, everything suddenly collided into chaos. A headline flashing across every screen. Shaw Enterprises in crisis. A scandal shakes the empire. His stomach twisted as the weight of the news hit him. His empire was under attack. His hands, once steady in the face of any challenge, gripped the phone tighter, his pulse racing. He had always prided himself on controlling the narrative, steering the company through crises with precision. But this wasn't something he had planned for. His mind raced through the possibilities: leaks, rumors, betrayal. David's gaze shifted to the conference room below, where the board members would soon converge. Each of them was waiting for answers. But the truth? He didn't have it yet. The room was spinning now, and with every second, the ground felt less stable. The headlines were only the beginning. His empire was crumbling, and the shockwaves were only starting. "I'll fix this," David muttered to himself, but even he couldn't believe the words. His grip on power was slipping, and he knew it was just a matter of time before everyone saw it. David Shaw sat at his desk, staring at the breaking news for what felt like hours. The world outside, once a well-oiled machine under his command, now seemed alien. He was a CEO, a titan of industry, but now in this moment he felt exposed, vulnerable. The emails from his board lay unopened in front of him. He couldn't bring himself to face them. His mind raced, darting between worst-case scenarios. A scandal, a financial disaster, or worse, betrayal. The corporate world wasn't kind to those who lost their grip. He'd seen it happen before, but never to him. He had built Shaw Enterprises from the ground up, clawing his way to the top. This empire was his legacy. Yet now, it felt like it could all slip through his fingers in the blink of an eye. David slammed his fist onto the desk, a burst of anger breaking his stillness. He wasn't going down without a fight. Not today. Not after everything he had sacrificed. The path forward was unclear, but there was no turning back. The battle for his empire had just begun. David Shaw had come a long way from his humble beginnings. His rise had been marked by sharp decisions, sacrifices, and a relentless pursuit of power. The memories of those early years flashed through his mind as he sat in his office, reflecting on what he had become. He had built Shaw Enterprises from the ground up, transforming it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But at what cost? The friendships he had lost, the personal relationships destroyed, the trust he had betrayed, these were all the consequences of his ambition. Even now, as he stared out at the city skyline, he couldn't help but wonder, had it all been worth it? The cold realization hit him that perhaps he had become the very thing he had once despised, the ruthless corporate tycoon, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for success. The thought haunted him, but he couldn't stop now. The empire was his, and nothing could take it away, at least, that's what he told himself. But as the news of the scandal spread, David felt the weight of his choices, knowing that the battle to preserve everything he had built was just beginning. David's phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael Grant, his main competitor and rival CEO. Michael had always been a thorn in David's side, but now it seemed like a full-fledged assault was underway. David's eyes narrowed as he read the message. Michael wasn't just making threats anymore. He was making moves. He was eyeing Shaw Enterprises, and the board was starting to listen to him. The last thing David needed was another power struggle, especially one he didn't initiate. The walls were closing in. His empire, which had once seemed so solid, now felt like it was made of glass, fragile, ready to shatter at any moment. David's mind raced with ideas on how to deal with Michael's growing influence. He had built Shaw Enterprises with his blood, sweat, and tears, and there was no way he was going to let Michael take it from him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he was no longer fighting for control. He was fighting to survive. Anna Hayes, David's longtime confidant, had always been the voice of reason. But today, as she entered his office with a grave look on her face, he knew something had changed. "David," she began, her voice low, "you need to be careful. Michael isn't the only threat. There are people inside the company who want you gone." The words hit David like a ton of bricks. For years, Anna had been his sounding board, the one person he could rely on. But now, even she was beginning to doubt him. "What are you saying?" David asked, his voice tight. Anna hesitated before continuing. "There's a mole in the company, someone feeding information to Michael. I don't know who yet, but they've been undermining you from the inside." The realization hit him hard. He was being attacked from both outside and within his own empire. He had to find the traitor before it was too late. The last thing he needed was another betrayal. David's phone rang incessantly as the day wore on. The board's demands, the media's pressure, and his team's uncertainty swirled around him like a storm. But one voice in particular was beginning to irritate him. Carla Edwards, his longtime ally and chief legal advisor, had been distant lately. Normally a sharp, steady presence in his corner, she had grown more evasive. When he asked her about the progress on the crisis, her answers seemed rehearsed, and her demeanor was colder than usual. David knew something was wrong. But what? He had trusted Carla implicitly, and her sudden distance was both puzzling and troubling. Was she losing faith in him, or was there something deeper at play? He couldn't afford to waste time with uncertainty. He needed answers, and fast. Yet when he tried to reach out to her, her responses were brief, and her excuses were thin. His instinct screamed at him that something was off. And in a world where loyalty was a commodity, betrayal always lingered just below the surface. David stared at the boardroom door where a new crisis loomed. With Carla's increasing silence, the pressure from the board was mounting. Each call, each email seemed to push him further toward the edge. They were asking for drastic action, something beyond his control. He needed more time, but time was a luxury he couldn't afford. The company's stock was plummeting, and the media was savaging Shaw Enterprises. Outside the room, the sound of nervous chatter grew louder. David could feel the walls closing in, the pressure pressing down on him from all sides. His team was looking to him for direction, but the truth was, he had no clear answers. The weight of the empire he'd built, now threatening to collapse, seemed unbearable. Every step felt like a gamble, and with each passing hour, his grip on the situation slipped further. If Carla was behind this, if she was betraying him, it would be a devastating blow. But David couldn't afford to think about that now. He had to act. He had to protect Shaw Enterprises, even if it meant taking desperate, irreversible steps. David made his way through the labyrinthine hallways of Shaw Enterprises, seeking refuge in the office of Jonah Cruz, his mentor and former CEO. Jonah had been ousted years ago, his warning against ambition and betrayal, now etched in David's memory. As he sat across from Jonah, the older man's weathered face seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 regrets. Jonah had lost everything once, his company, his family, his sense of purpose. Now retired and bitter, Jonah was a cautionary tale, a shadow of his former self. But today, his words carried a weight David couldn't ignore. "David, you can't play this game without losing a piece of yourself," Jonah said, his voice gravelly with age. "I did it. I lost everything. Trust is fragile, especially in this world." The words hit David like a cold wind. Was Jonah warning him of Carla's betrayal, or was it something more? David wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. The cost of ambition was steeper than he ever realized. He couldn't afford to lose the only thing that truly mattered, his empire. The morning after his conversation with Jonah, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The signs had been there, hidden in plain sight. Small missteps, unexplained delays, and now Carla's odd behavior. As he sat in his office, staring at the files, a harsh realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Caleb Ross, the company's chief technology officer, was no longer answering his calls. His security access had been revoked, and there were whispers of financial discrepancies that pointed directly to him. David felt his chest tighten. The company had a mole, an insider who was feeding information to the enemy. The sabotage was far deeper than he had feared. But who could it be? Who was betraying him from the inside? And why? The answers were just out of reach, but David knew one thing for sure. Shaw Enterprises was under attack, and the enemy was closer than he ever imagined. David couldn't believe his eyes as he stared at the damning email on his laptop screen. The contents were clear. Carla Edwards, his trusted legal advisor, had been leaking sensitive information to his rivals. The betrayal felt personal, almost unbearable. This was the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, helping him navigate the toughest of business challenges. Yet here she was, betraying him for a larger share of power. The walls seemed to close in on him as the realization set in. Carla had been working with Michael Grant, his manipulative rival, all along. It was all coming together now. Carla's coldness, her evasiveness, her sudden absences. She had been playing him, using his trust to secure her own future. The anger boiled inside him, but it was tempered with a cold, bitter understanding. The world of high-stakes business wasn't kind, and trust was just a fragile illusion. The battle for Shaw Enterprises had just taken a devastating turn, and David knew that the worst was yet to come. David sat at his desk, a cold sweat beading on his forehead as the weight of betrayal crushed him. He'd trusted Caleb Ross, the company's chief technology officer, implicitly. But now, every piece of evidence pointed to Caleb's involvement in leaking sensitive information. The financial discrepancies, the missing files, the suspicious activity on company accounts, they all led back to him. The data breach that had nearly crippled Shaw Enterprises hadn't been a random attack. It was an inside job. Caleb had orchestrated it with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to exploit Shaw Enterprises' vulnerabilities. David's mind raced, replaying every meeting, every conversation, every subtle shift in Caleb's behavior. How had he missed it? The realization hit David like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on external threats, so consumed by his own empire's survival, that had ignored the possibility that the enemy was already inside. His hand gripped the phone tighter. He needed answers, and fast. The stakes were higher than ever, and if Caleb was part of the sabotage, he was no longer just a liability. He was a dangerous enemy. In the midst of the chaos, an unexpected figure stepped forward. Nina Wolfe, the underestimated head of marketing. David had never given Nina much thought. She was young, quiet, and always seemed to stay out of the limelight. But now, something about her was different. She walked into his office with a new resolve, her eyes sharp, her posture confident. "I have information," Nina said, her voice steady despite the palpable tension in the room. David raised an eyebrow, wondering what angle she was playing. But as she detailed what she'd uncovered, evidence of Caleb's sabotage and leaks to Michael Grant, he couldn't help but be impressed. She'd been tracking company data that no one else had thought to monitor, piecing together the puzzle that everyone else had missed. Nina had proved her worth, and now she was positioning herself as a key player in the unfolding battle. David realized that underestimating her had been a mistake. Nina was more than just a marketing head, she was a strategist in her own right, and she had just become his most valuable ally. "We need to move quickly," Nina added, her voice now laced with urgency. "Before he knows we're onto him." As David listened to Nina's report, he realized that the company's survival was no longer in his hands alone. Michael Grant, his manipulative rival, had been one step ahead of him at every turn. David had always known Michael was dangerous, but now, the full extent of his machinations was becoming clear. Michael had been waiting for this moment, the moment Shaw Enterprises faltered. The leaks, the media attacks, the stock plummeting, it was all part of a plan to weaken David and take control of the company. Michael had the resources, the alliances, and the patience to strike at the perfect moment. Now, David was racing against time, trying to outmaneuver a man who had been plotting his downfall long before this crisis started. Every decision David made was now under the microscope. Every move he took was being counted before he even made it. Michael Grant had been playing the long game, and David was just now beginning to understand the true cost of underestimating him. "We have to act," David muttered, as the pressure to protect his empire mounted. Michael wasn't going to give up easily, and neither would David. David stood in the boardroom, the faces of his most trusted allies staring back at him. He could feel the weight of their expectations bearing down on him. This was it, the moment where he would either rise to the occasion or watch everything he'd worked for crumble. The plan was risky, but it was the only way forward. He was going to confront Caleb directly. David knew it could backfire. If Caleb was truly working with Michael Grant, then exposing him would send shockwaves through the company. But David was running out of time. Every minute he wasted was a minute closer to losing everything. "We'll take it to the board," David declared, his voice firm. "We need to show them we still have control." The room fell silent, the tension thick as his team processed the weight of his decision. This wasn't just about saving the company anymore, it was about reclaiming his authority. The stakes had never been higher, and David knew the risks. But one thing was certain, he was going to fight until the very end. David's heart raced as he watched Caleb enter the boardroom. The air was thick with unspoken words, and David knew that this conversation would determine everything. Caleb's eyes flickered nervously as he took his seat. David wasted no time. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice cold. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between David and the other board members. "You've been leaking information to our competitors," David continued, his words cutting through the tension. "And I'm giving you one chance to explain yourself." The room went silent, and for a brief moment, Caleb appeared cornered. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by uncertainty. David could see the fear in his eyes. This was it, the moment of truth. Would Caleb deny it, or would he try to make a deal? The silence stretched on, and David's pulse quickened. He had no idea how this would end, but he was prepared for anything. David's hands trembled as he sat at the conference table, staring at the file in front of him. The last few hours had felt like a blur, a maze of deceit and broken promises. But now, a single name had emerged from the chaos: Jonah Cruz. Former CEO, a man David had once considered a mentor, was the shadow investor pulling the strings from the shadows. David's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. Jonah had been playing the long game, carefully orchestrating Shaw Enterprises' decline. From the very beginning, Jonah had known David would rise to the top, and he'd been waiting for the right moment to destroy him. The betrayal stung deeper than David expected. This wasn't just business, it was personal. Jonah had been the one who taught him everything. He had been the father figure David never had. Now Jonah was the very one trying to bring him down, to tear apart the empire they'd built together. As the truth sank in, David's resolve hardened. He would confront Jonah. He had no choice. The game was about to change, and David was ready to face the man who had secretly been his greatest adversary all along. The confrontation was inevitable. David had arranged to meet Jonah in his private office, a place that once felt like home. As David stepped inside, the older man's presence filled the room. Jonah Cruz, early 60s, was seated behind his mahogany desk, his hands steepled in front of him as if he were waiting for this moment. "You're angry," Jonah said softly, his voice gravelly from years of wear. "You have every right to be." David didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the man who had once been his mentor. Jonah continued, "But you have to understand, David, this wasn't personal, this was business." David's pulse quickened. "Business?" he repeated incredulously. "You've been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, sabotaging my company, everything I've worked for. How can you say it wasn't personal?" Jonah leaned back in his chair, the weight of his words sinking in. "You were always going to be the best at this, David," Jonah said. "And that's why I had to bring you down." His eyes glinted with a mix of admiration and something darker. "I knew it would take someone like you to understand this game, but you're not ready for the consequences." The silence between them was suffocating, and David's mind reeled. His mentor, his guide, had been the one to orchestrate his fall. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on him. Jonah's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. "You see, David, everything I did for you. David shook his head, unable to process what he was hearing. "For me," he muttered. "You've been plotting against me for years. You've been manipulating everything. How could this possibly be for me?" Jonah's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the smirk returned. "You were always meant to be the leader, David, but leaders are alone. I had to make you strong. I had to test you." David's chest tightened, his mind spinning. He wanted to rage, to shout at Jonah, but instead he remained silent, letting the older man speak. "You didn't need me anymore," Jonah continued. "You were becoming the very thing I couldn't be, but that's where the mistake lies. You think you can control everything. You think you can fight this system. But you can't, David, not alone." David stood there, his breath shallow. The man who had once taught him everything had now broken him. "I've already made my moves," Jonah said, rising from his desk. "The pieces are in place. The game is over." The finality in his voice was chilling. David's mind raced. What did Jonah mean by this? What had he done to ensure David's downfall was inevitable? David stood at the window, staring out at the city, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. The revelation about Jonah had shattered everything he thought he knew. All this time he had believed he was fighting for control of Shaw Enterprises. But now he realized that the true battle had always been about power. Who controlled the narrative? Who controlled the future? Jonah had been right about one thing. David had been alone in this. He had surrounded himself with people he thought he could trust, only to be betrayed at every turn. His mind went back to the moment when he'd first met Jonah, the man who had shaped his understanding of power and ambition. David had idolized him. But now he could see the cracks in the foundation. The very empire they had built was a house of cards, and with Jonah's manipulation, it was destined to fall. He couldn't let this end like this. David knew he had to fight, but how? What would be left after this war? The answers eluded him, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going down without a fight. He was going to take back control, no matter the cost. David's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He stared at the screen, his heart sinking as he read the words. "Your company is mine. You've lost. The takeover is complete." The message was from Jonah, confirming what David had feared. The game was over. Shaw Enterprises had been absorbed by a shell company controlled by Jonah's unseen investors. All the sacrifices, all the battles had been for nothing. David had been outmaneuvered. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had lost everything. His empire was gone, and with it, his sense of purpose. The next step seemed inevitable. David had no choice but to fight for his personal survival now. The company was lost, but he wasn't. Not yet. He had to regain control, but the path ahead was uncertain. He had been beaten, but he wasn't done fighting. Jonah had made his move, and now it was David's turn to decide how to play the final hand. The stakes had never been higher. As David Shaw sat in the boardroom, he knew this was the moment he had to make or break his future. Shaw Enterprises, his legacy, was slipping through his fingers. Jonah had taken it all: the control, the power, the influence. David's heart raced. This was a gamble, but there was no other choice. He had one last card to play: the board vote. With Jonah's influence at its peak, David couldn't rely on any familiar allies. Everyone in the room, from the board members to his remaining confidants, was watching him, waiting for a sign. He'd lost so much already: his trust, his empire, and now his sanity. But this was the fight of his life. If he won this vote, he could take back control. If not, he would be nothing. "I've fought for this company every day," David said, his voice unwavering despite the pressure. "This isn't just about power, it's about survival. And I won't let anyone take that away." He stood tall, meeting the gaze of each board member as they weighed the consequences of their decisions. It was now or never. The tension in the room thickened, and David could almost hear his pulse pounding in his ears. This was his last shot. He wasn't going to let Jonah win. Not without a fight. David had taken the first step by calling the vote. Now, with Jonah seated across from him, the reality of the battle hit him like a punch to the gut. Jonah's cold smile only fueled the anger inside David. He had known, deep down, that this was coming. Jonah had manipulated every move, every decision, and now they were finally face to face. Jonah's eyes gleamed as he leaned back in his chair, his hands folded casually in front of him. "You've made your move, David," Jonah said with a calculated calmness. "But you know as well as I do that this game was never really yours to win. It was always mine." David's grip tightened on the table. The betrayal, the years of deception, it all rushed back to him in that moment. But there was no time for regret. David had to win this, for everything he had built, for everything he had sacrificed. He took a deep breath. "You're wrong," David replied, his voice firm. "This fight isn't over. Not while I'm still standing." The final vote was about to be cast, and David had to believe that at this moment he could still reclaim what was rightfully his. Jonah's smirk remained, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eye. It was far from over. The vote was about to happen. David's heart was in his throat as he stared at the board members, each of them holding their fate in their hands. Jonah had set the pieces in motion, but David had his own plan, his own way of turning the tide. The room was silent, except for the rustle of papers as the votes were cast. One by one, each board member placed their decision in front of the chairperson. David's stomach churned as the ballots were counted. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Each vote represented a part of his soul, a part of Shaw Enterprises, and the very future of the company. The room held its breath as the chairperson read the results. David had barely heard the words, but he felt the air shift when the final vote was announced. "The motion passes," the chairperson said, their voice almost drowned out by the tension in the room. For a moment, everything stood still. David's mind raced as the realization settled in. He had won. Just so. But at what cost? The battle had been fierce, but the war for Shaw Enterprises was far from over. David had regained control. But for how long? Jonah stood up slowly, his calm demeanor now replaced by something more calculating. "You've won, David," he said with a trace of respect, though it was tinged with bitterness. "But this isn't the end. It's only the beginning. You'll see." He paused for a moment, as if the words were not just for David, but for himself. "You're still a pawn in a much larger game," Jonah added, his voice growing cold again. David's chest tightened as he stood there, watching Jonah make his way to the door. Jonah had been right about one thing. This was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. Jonah's departure left a vacuum, and David knew that, for all his victories, there was still so much more to fight for. His empire was safe for now, but the price of victory weighed heavily on him. As Jonah left the room, David took a deep breath. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let go of Shaw Enterprises without a fight. Not now, not ever. David stood alone in the boardroom, the weight of everything that had transpired settling on his shoulders. Shaw Enterprises was still his, but at what cost? His victory felt hollow. Jonah's words echoed in his mind. "You're still a pawn in a much larger game." Had Jonah been right all along? Was there more at play than David could see? As he stood there alone in the quiet, the enormity of his actions began to sink in. What had he sacrificed for this victory? His personal relationships, his integrity, his sense of self, everything had been consumed in the fire of ambition. But now, as the silence filled the room, David knew one thing: he had won. For now. The future was uncertain, but he had proven to himself, and to the world, that he was not easily defeated. The empire he had built was still standing, but at what price? That was a question he would have to answer in the days to come. David sat in his now empty office. Shaw Enterprises was no longer his. The board had voted him out. All his efforts had come to this. He had failed. The company he built was now in the hands of Jonah's allies, and he had nothing left. David, struggling to rebuild his life, knew it would take years to regain his trust and reputation. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future, even if it meant starting from nothing. Nina Wolfe had proved herself, but now she was taking over Shaw Enterprises. Her rise to power was swift, but David knew she would face challenges of her own. It wasn't over for either of them. Anna Hayes, David's loyal confidant, now faces her own choices. She had always stood by him, but now, with everything lost, she must decide: stay with David or move forward with Shaw Enterprises under Nina. David stood in front of his new small office, a simple space. It wasn't much, but it was his. He had lost everything, but he had not lost his will. A new fight had begun. David stood in front of the window, reflecting on everything he had lost: his empire, his friends, his peace of mind. It was a bittersweet moment, knowing he had lost the battle but learned a hard lesson in the process. Nina Wolfe had proven herself as the new leader of Shaw Enterprises, but with power came immense pressure. She understood now that the real challenge had just begun: keeping what David had built. David and Jonah's final conversation was one of mutual recognition. Jonah had won, but David wasn't defeated. In the end, they both knew the cost of ambition, and that knowledge lingered between them. David watched from the sidelines as Nina took over the company, now firmly in her hands. There was a sense of finality in the shift, but a part of him felt pride in knowing Shaw Enterprises would continue to thrive under new leadership. David stood alone in front of his new office. It was small, but it was his. He had learned from his failures and was ready to rebuild, starting with a fresh perspective on life and business.